to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. Today we've got an old guest from the show a number of years ago, Brettwarren, who's the Chief Buyer's Agent at Metropole. And we talk about the topic of property investing versus creating long-term wealth. My first question, of course, is what is the difference, and is there any difference? And Brett guides us through his mindset and his philosophy around creating long-term wealth and how that differs from chasing hotspots and those sorts of things. However, I do hit him with some curly ones about the hotspots and about some of the regions versus the capital cities, about the price points, and do my best to pick apart his philosophy, but he's up to the challenge. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy this one with Brett. I thought it was a great interview with Brett. He gave a lot of good insights. So here's Brett. Brettwarren, thanks for joining me back on Geared for Growth.
Great to be back, Mike. It's been a while, so always good to be on the podcast.
Has been a while. Might have even been pre-COVID. So, geez, I don't know what went wrong.
Yeah, I think so. I think everyone fell in a hole over COVID, didn't they? So good to be back.
Good to throw the rope ladder down into that hole from whence you came, Brett. And you're bringing some things up the ladder, some insights into the property market at large, where you guys are active at the moment. But the topic of today was the difference between property investing and creating long-term wealth. Now, I'm sure that people would consider them kind of the same thing, but you contend that there is kind of a difference.
I think there's a big difference, Mike, because I think inadvertently most people who are investing in property generally want to create some kind of wealth at the end. But I think it's what you set out to achieve that's really, really important. You know, I think if I was going to fly on a plane down to Newcastle to see you, I wouldn't just rock up to the airport and hope there's a plane going. I'd probably want to plan out my trip. I'd know when to leave, what's going to happen at the other end, how am I going to get to where you are, what time zones are we in, all those kinds of things are part of what I need to understand at the end. So I think most property investors don't really understand what they want to achieve, what they want to get out of the properties moving forward. You're a bit of a statistics man yourself. I think 71 or 72% of property investors only own one property. And I think a lot of those are people who have probably gone into it thinking about property investing and wanting to get into it. Maybe they're accidental investors that moved out of a home. And then if you ramp it up to two properties, that brings it up to kind of 92%. So I think to become wealthy, I think everyone kind of understands that you do need to own more than probably two properties. And by the way, the number of properties don't really count, but certainly you need more than two. So 90% of investors, I think, are really focusing on that property investing, but they don't have a long-term strategy and a long-term plan. Because when you do that and you know exactly where you want to be, I know where I want to be in 15 years' time. I know how much income I want to be earning. I know how many properties I need, what size my portfolio is. And now I can actually reverse engineer the whole process, come back to where I am today and actually put a plan in place and understand that. Because there's a number of different phases throughout the journey that you're going to have to navigate.
I like that. And I suppose if I was a better marketer, I would have continued with this push. But we sort of had this unofficial goal of the podcast as reducing the percentage of people that only ever own one property, because there's a fairly strong argument to say that one isn't enough. I mean, what's your sort of view on that?
Well, mine is all about quality over quantity because, you know, look, I prefer to own 3 or 4 really great assets rather than 10 average assets. At the end of the day, for every $100,000 you're going to want in retirement, you're going to need about $3 million of property unencumbered, giving you about a 3 or 4% return. So if you've got $3 million, whether that's one property or 5 properties doesn't really matter. But I can assure you, if you've got any more than 10 or 15 properties, when you retire, you're probably going to be a part-time property manager. So there's nothing wrong with having 3 or 4 amazing properties in amazing locations that are going to grow and compound and leverage and, you know, put you into retirement and actually help you. I know most property investors also, the majority I speak to, it's not just about them. It's also leaving a legacy for the next generation that's important to them as well.
Well, I mean, it might be really important for our children's sort of generation because no matter what your viewpoint is, it definitely is harder to buy a property today than it was, 10 or 20 years ago. And if the government keep going the way that they're going, it's not likely to be a trend that's reversed, right?
100%. Yeah, you're definitely right on that.
I can remember having a conversation, it may have been with yourself or it could have been Michael, and this would have been probably pre-COVID, where we were talking about quality assets versus, the stuff that leaps off the social media page, 10 properties in 10 years or 30 by 30 and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think the comment was along the lines of, you need about 500K to get what we consider a blue chip asset or a quality asset. And I asked the question, all right, well, what if you don't have that amount? And the response was, well, save up until you do. I'm interested to note whether that's a philosophy that you guys have kept. Obviously, that price point is now very, very different. You can't get anything much for 500K, but like, where do you sort of sit at it? Is there a minimum sort of spend to get what you deem a quality asset?
Yeah, look, I mean, it has changed a little bit. It's probably more 550, 600 now. Look, it's a dangerous one, Mike, because I think, we've held that firm view for a long time. We probably got made look a bit silly in the last 5 years because you could have bought anything anywhere and the property market would have gone up. So hindsight's always a good thing, and people can come back and say, oh, well, you got that wrong and all the rest, and that's fine. But, you've got to deal with what information you got at the time. And I certainly think the next 5 years are going to be very, very different. So I think the type of assets that have grown in value in the next 5 years, there's probably going to be a level of risk associated with those properties because the next boom is probably not another 5 or 10 years away. So, I still stand by that. I think you're better off holding your cards close to your chest. If you can get into something at 550, 600, you can still get into an international city and a good city with a good prospect of growth. And you're also going to have less risk in that particular market as well. So if you had to follow that, 5 years ago, sure, you may not be ahead of where you needed to be right now, but I guarantee you, in the next 5 years, you're not going to have lost that money and you still would have made some ground.
Yeah, I guess that's the point, isn't it? I was sort of thinking, gosh, I'm throwing him, a curly one here, and I felt sorry for you, even though I still did it. But I thought if I was going to argue the point, it would be about the risk piece, right? So, I mean, the best performing property market in the last 100 years, it probably was a mining town. And if you cut the sort of the filter of the dates, you could probably find somewhere that grew like 800% in 6 months or something like that. Now that'll always beat a capital city, but it's the risk that's associated with it as well. And would you say, there's certain markets that have gone absolutely gangbusters, places like Perth, places like Townsville. Would you consider these areas much riskier than the typical places that you would park investors?
I would, yeah. I certainly would. I think there is a greater level of risk there, and history will show because we can go back 20 years and look at how a suburb's performed after it's boomed. Use Perth as an example. Townsville's probably very, very similar, but they're both kind of resource-rich towns. You might be too young, Mike, but you remember back in 2006 and 7, the Perth and Sydney house prices were pretty much level. And
yes,
Perth had just gone through that massive boom as it has now. It took another 12 years for Perth to get going again. Sydney had doubled in value and almost tripled in value during that time, and so had most of the other markets. So, Townsville's probably something more that doesn't have the growth, but it also, in a downturn, it actually falls a lot. It doesn't fall 5 or 10% like a capital city and recover 12 or 18 months later. It probably drops more like 20%. So certainly that risk factor, and most of those kinds of outer areas, you notice that the incomes of people, they're kind of living paycheck to paycheck. They've got to invest, they've got to save a lot of money, and it takes time to save. So I think at this stage of the cycle, a lot of markets are maxed out. It's probably going to take another 5 to 7 years for the markets to recharge and people to save and have that next level of going again, if that makes sense. And always in those suburbs where there's a downturn and a GFC or something like that, people are living paycheck to paycheck. That's how you get the sell-off of houses and the prices dropping as well. So I think we're a bit more closer to something like that happening than actually the next boom in Australia at the moment.
And I do remember that period of time was, I think, where Perth actually overtook Sydney's median house price, which sounds ridiculous today that could be the case. I mean, Perth's been humming along and it's gone from, I think, second last position after Darwin or Hobart to mid-pack, but very unlikely to reach $1 million in the next little while. And Sydney's been there for a while, right?
I think so. And we look at a lot of the property clocks and things like that as well. And I think, Perth, Adelaide and Hobart, I think have done their dash. The only thing that's keeping it afloat at the moment is probably investors getting in there late to the market. And that's a bit of a tricky one when you hear your Uber driver, or back in the day, your taxi driver or your hairdressers talking about investing somewhere because they've probably missed the boat and they're the last people to get in there. So I think that's what's keeping that market afloat. It'll probably slow. And then I think Sydney and Brisbane have probably got another 6 or 12 months, depending on what happens with interest rates as well.
Yes, yeah, that is the big elephant in the room. But let's get back to the original topic, the difference between property investing and creating long-term wealth. there's an application for property markets here, right? Because a lot of people get really sucked into the hotspots or where's the boom location. But if you're creating long-term wealth, you sort of can't just rely on one bumper cycle, because that property might do 20 or 30% in 12 months, but it could be overtaken by something that's sort of humming along at a much more modest clip. How do you analyze a market when you're trying to think about long-term wealth creation?
Great question, mate. Great question, because I think a lot of people miss this. So the difference is, if you're looking to enter a market now, a lot of people look at the technical analysis, what's happening in the here and now. So they want to know what the days on market are, what's happening to the median house prices, are asking prices going up or down, vacancy rates. They're looking at auction clearance rates. They're looking at the temporary supply and demand issues of the area, all those kinds of short-term things. And those things can change from month to month. So they're not going to be any good to you in 5 or 10 years' time. If I look at creating longer term wealth, again, if I'm looking to hold this property for 20 years and maybe pass it down to my kids and hold it for 30 or 40 years, I'm trying to make a decision of what's going to happen in 30 or 40 years' time. So whatever happens in the next 5 years is irrelevant, really. Great, sure, it'd be great to have some money, but if we're getting those good, consistent gains over a 20 or 30-year period, we're going to end up in front. So the long-term fundamentals we look at are the things that aren't going to change. 80% of people who move to Australia are generally moving to Sydney and Melbourne. That's not going to change in the next 10 years. A lot of those people are escaping to the back door and heading up to Brisbane. So that's 80% of people moving to those kinds of locations. And in the inner to middle ring suburbs, there's just no more land available. So, we don't buy in outskirts where there's high demand, low supply. There's a lot of land still to be developed, a lot of housing estates to happen. We're looking at those rising incomes where consistently over a 10 or 20-year period, incomes are well above the average and continuing to grow. We want to be landlocked, in those kinds of locations. And then, people try and reinvent the wheel, I think, Mike, when they invest, but you really just have to go back to human nature. If I'm going to move to an area, I'm going to want to live close to work. So let's get close to the bigger employment hubs, the CBDs, the hospitals, all those kinds of things, the airports that are starting to expand. If I've got children, I'm going to have children one day. I'm going to want to be close to school catchments and, the sought after school precincts and things like that as well. The next generation don't want to keep moving out. They want the coffee shops, the restaurants. So walkability is going to be incredibly important. You want to buy in areas that are gentrifying and younger families, retirees are moving out, people are coming in and, putting up prices and things like that as well. So that's kind of the long-term factors that are going to take decades and decades to change, because I'm trying to gauge what's going to happen over a 20 or 30-year period rather than looking at what's happening in the here and now. And it's easy to get sucked in by a headline of 10 properties in 10 minutes or, make $20,000 a week from cash flow positive property and things. Those kind of things are, I guess, trapping people in because they're not thinking about that longer term. And even if they get it right, and a lot of people have got it right over COVID because they've just bought anywhere and done anything, but will the next 5 years be the same and will the next decade be the same? I think you will see a return to the fundamentals and good quality assets, and that's stood the test of time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one to argue, but I'm going to try anyway. I mean,
Please.
the naysayers would say, okay, well, if you want to grow your portfolio to a certain size and you're not on $1 million a year as a Chief Justice or, Governor of the RBA, you do actually have to kind of hack your way to get there. And that's where I think people are zeroing in on these hotspots. Yep. They might be on 65, 70K a year. They can pick something up, maybe it's 400,000 or 500,000 and it could do 20% in 12 months if they're lucky. And that's the way to actually springboard them onto the next one. And maybe these properties don't have great 10 or 20 year fundamentals, but without that approach, they wouldn't really have a chance of getting to that $3 million sort of unencumbered property portfolio. What would you say to that? The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Yeah, look, I completely get that point. The difficult thing, Mike, is it's just so hard to pick. I mean, everything looks fantastic in hindsight. When do you sell? When do you get in? I guess, like I said, in the last decade or in the last 5 years in particular, those property markets have done exceptionally well. if I had some guarantee that you could do that, then I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But it's always for me about quality over quantity. If you can afford a $550,000, $600,000 property, you should get the best available property you can. If you can't afford to buy for that, you should probably try and get yourself into a position to do that, because I think in the next 12 months in particular, it will be easier. We'll likely get a rate cut or two. The APRA buffer is still in play. That could potentially come back a little bit. Wages are rising, rents are rising, and things like that as well. So I would be more inclined. I'm more of a conservative, Mike, so I don't like risk. But I'm more inclined to just wait and get into the right property at the right time. And then when you do, as I said before, it's amazing. The first 3 or 4 years are quite difficult because you've got to come up with money and you've got to pay things, and there's a bit of pain there, right? You're going to make some sacrifices. But if that property if a $500,000 property can compound and leverage and be worth $1 million in 10 or 12 years' time, and that allows you to buy another property, and then in 20 years' time you've got your $3 or $4 million from 2, maybe 3 properties, and you've managed to pay down some of that debt, I think you're going to be in a considerably better position than just kind of pulling out $20,000 a year here and there, and which you're getting taxed on anyway. And a lot of people who probably bought cash flow positive 2 or 3 years ago are probably struggling a bit at the moment because interest rates have just gone up so quick. So it's a difficult one. And I know that's a fair, very, very fair argument, a very, very fair point. And a lot of people have probably done okay in the last 5 years, but I'm just concerned about the next 5 years. That's all.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And one of the points that you sort of put down as part of this macro topic was market timing. So, I mean, you did mention, getting the right property at the right time. What does that exactly mean to you? Because I guess if you're not obsessed about getting in at the right time to get that big uptick in growth at the beginning, then you're not playing in markets that are as competitive. And there's got to be some value in that as long as the market does perform eventually.
Yeah. I guess getting back to kind of what I said before, the truth of this thing is with interest rates and market timing and cycles, honestly, Mike, no one knows what happens next. I've been working with Michael Yardy, who's been doing this for 50 years, and if anyone should know what happens next, it's him. So he does have expectations, but he doesn't have forecast about what's going to happen. So, I think timing the market's really great if you can do that, but it's not the only thing you need to do. If you can get into the market at the right time, I guess in 10 or 20 years' time, and we've actually done some research on this, in 20 years' time, it actually doesn't make a difference. If you bought at the peak of this market, if you bought in Perth right now, or you bought in a capital city right now, in the right area, in the right location, in 20 years' time, it's actually not going to matter if you bought a year earlier or a year later. There's no considerable margin of difference. What's going to matter the most, and I think one of our friends, Stuart Weems, did a great piece of work and research on, what impacts property and growth the most, and looked at kind of, negative gearing and cash flow and interest rates and all those things. The number one thing was getting the right property in the right area and just having that extra maybe 1 or 2 percentage points capital growth per annum that allows it to compound and leverage and grow. So I guess it's getting into those markets that are going to do that, and also that are safer. The capital city markets really drop below a 5 or 10% over a downturn, and they recover much quicker. So that's going to help you in the long-term game as well.
I mean, that's an interesting point because, we can see, and we definitely did see during the COVID boom, the pace of the market sort of dropping was the fastest that we'd seen. But, you go back the last couple of cycles, we don't really see anything above 10% annual growth really ever in Australia. But that's the macro view. But I'm guessing that there are pockets around the country that can see much bigger downturns than that, and that's sort of what you're talking about here, is to avoid those places.
100%. That's an average. Just like you look at the Brisbane average. 40%. There's properties that would have done 50. There's properties that would have done 30. So there's not one market. So the idea is what we try to do also is get those best markets, but then to get the best properties in the best market. So we're actually outperforming the average. So I always say to our clients, I cannot guarantee you what the market's going to do, but I can guarantee you when the market does do well, we're going to outperform that particular market. And again, that's the same on the way down. We don't want to buy markets that are going to lose more than the average and lose 15 or 20% because historically they take a lot longer to recover and recharge and gain some of that growth back.
Now, say we do the work, or we do the homework, or we sit down with our financial planner and we go, okay, well, this is what we want our income to be at, let's say, retirement age. And, you talked before about, where you want to be in 15 years, how big your portfolio needs to be to sort out, your passive income. If we've done that work, you talked about reverse engineering it.
Yeah.
So if we're going and we're starting on that journey, what is the first starting point when we know, okay, well, we're aiming for X, but, one property's not going to cut it, but it's the first step on the path?
Yeah, great question. So we've got some good software that we use to help understand that. But in my mind, if most people you're listening here, they've probably got a 15 or 20-year runway. So I'd suggest they cut it in half straight away.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got, 10 years and 10 years, 2 10-year periods. The first 10 years is about accumulating. You've got to buy enough assets. You've got to accumulate. So, for example, if you want a $3 million property portfolio, in the next 10 years, you might want to buy 2 properties that are worth $750 each.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of got that halfway mark. Once you've got that, as long as you've got the right properties that are going to grow and compound and leverage, you don't necessarily need to buy any more properties, because at some stage, Mike, you've actually got to reduce and pay down debt.
Mm.
And this is what a lot of people don't understand. They think they can keep buying properties, but at some stage, you've got to consolidate and take debt out of your portfolio. So then you've got something to kind of live off. And then at the end, you've got that exit strategy where, you can maybe sell a property, which we hope you don't have to, because you can then pass down to the next generation. You've got your super there. Maybe you've got an inheritance or some savings or things like that to reduce debt. So that's the big picture. But when you're starting, the first step, and Michael always says this, property investing is a game of finance with a few properties thrown in. So
right.
You need to work out what your borrowing capacity is. And again, if it's anywhere, in my opinion, if it's anywhere between 500 and say 1.5 million, you should be just looking at one property. You don't need to buy 3 properties in 3 different areas in 3 different locations. There's more risk involved. You're going to pay more fees and things like that as well. And I would argue you're probably getting into inferior locations where the demographics aren't right, the long-term fundamentals aren't right. There's more supply than demand and things like that as well.
Mm.
And then rinse and repeat. Hibernate, hold on. When you've got the ability, you've got some equity in your portfolio. Interest rates change, rents have risen. You can buy another property. It's the same process from there until you've got enough of an asset base that you can see you've got the right properties and you can understand that the market's going to do what it's going to do and grow and compound and leverage. And then it comes about debt reduction. Or at that point, maybe look at a commercial property or look at something with more cash flow in it that'll help reduce debt faster. But the first thing I think is the game changer in life is capital growth and having, some people have probably made $300,000 or $400,000 in the last 2 or 3 years. And I would take that every day over a $20,000 or $30,000 worth of cash flow each year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's
anyone
funny
who tells you can get both is wrong. So
yeah, right. That's a whole nother episode.
Oh, it is, absolutely.
So if it's not too cheeky a question, and I'm not asking for your secret herbs and spices and inside leg measurement, where are some of the places around the country that you're active in, and what is it about the fundamentals and the research that makes them attractive to the philosophy we've been talking about today?
Yeah, look, I think we're very open with that. I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about where I've got a very strong belief because what we've done and what I've seen my portfolio do. I've been investing for 20 years and I've just followed what Michael's told me to do and it's worked. And I've seen it work for so many of our clients. So I guess at the moment, look, I do still think there's some good opportunities in the Brisbane market, particularly. I'm based in Brisbane, so I know Brisbane fairly well. As long as you're getting within that kind of 10 or 12K ring, I don't think you're going to too far wrong for either a townhouse or a house. I probably wouldn't be looking at apartments in Brisbane. I think there's been a few oversupply issues before. I think that'll probably happen towards the future as well. So you want something with land content, maybe a villa or a townhouse or preferably a house.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere between 800 and 1.1 is probably a good sweet spot. I guess Michael uses a monopoly analogy too. If you land on Mayfair, Mike, what do?
Well, you've got to buy the thing, haven't you?
You've got to buy it, right?
You borrow, beg and steal.
Absolutely. So I think the Sydney market, at somewhere around the 700-800 mark is a good opportunity to get into that market for an apartment that's very, very, very low maintenance. You're going to get a really, really good rental return because people have started moving back to Sydney, students, accommodation after COVID. So you've got a good rental return there. And Michael always says, if you land on Mayfair, you buy it. And it's probably the last time anyone's going to be able to get into Sydney in a great area, probably south of the city down towards Cogra for that kind of price point. In select areas and select streets, as you know, we don't buy in all the suburbs. We want the best streets, the quiet streets, the small complexes and things like that as well. And last of all, Melbourne, I just think Melbourne's a huge opportunity. We've seen a couple of little spots there in Melbourne in the southeast where we can actually get a house now between 700 and 800. We've been buying in a few little pockets in the outer southeast suburbs where we started buying there for homeowners and every time we went out there was another house knocked over and people are rebuilding. And, we looked at the incomes for the area and they're starting to gentrify and there's no supply of land. The area is landlocked with reserve around it. It's close to the water. So there's those kind of pockets we really do our research on. And I just think, we talked about Perth before being over the top. Melbourne's about 6 on the dwelling price list at the moment. And for me, that just screams opportunity, especially when I read every day in the paper that Melbourne's a basket case and it's going to fall over. And I mean, that just for me, that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, after you sort of said this is a rare opportunity to perhaps get into Sydney, my brain went straight to Melbourne, because I suppose a lot of this comes from political intervention to some degree, minimum standards, legislation, some of the other tenancy changes. But the big one is the land tax changes, right? Which supposedly is a 10-year levy and then it'll kind of disappear. I mean, but it also could be repealed at any point in time, assuming the state isn't sort of bankrupt, and it seems to be having a few issues. So do you think that it'll grow just because it is kind of undervalued compared to everywhere else, or will it grow because people have priced the land tax in and it can't really go anywhere backwards because it is an international city of note? It is a big attractor for international migration, and it's one of the biggest cities in Australia.
Great questions. And look, let's go back to what I said before. If you're looking technically at Melbourne and you're looking to buy in Melbourne now, you're thinking all those kind of things you talked about: COVID, hungover from COVID, Andrew's government's done what it's done. There's all these land taxes coming in. Rents are going one way and landlord rights are going one way. You probably wouldn't touch it. But what you've got to understand is long-term fundamentals. This is just a blip on the radar. You've also got to understand what drives property prices. In my opinion, it's homeowners that drive property prices. So homeowners don't care about land tax. Homeowners don't care about all those other things that are going on, tenants' rights, all the rest of it. What they care about is buying a home in a great location. And it's still the great Australian dream. And I think that's lacking in Melbourne because it's been locked down for 2 years. Within the next 6 to 12 months, I suspect that will change, Mike, because now that people have moved there, they know where they're living, where they want to live, their families, their schools, they'll start buying again. I can't help but think, we're starting to see a little bit of this at the moment at Metropole. People are actually handing back their keys who are tenants and saying, look, now's the time to buy. I'm sick of my rents going up. I'm sick of queuing up to get tenants. And within the next 12 months, if we get those interest rate cuts, it's pretty much going to be cheaper to have a mortgage than rent in Melbourne. So that is what will bring homeowners back. And as long as you're buying in homeowner-dominated locations in the inner to middle ring suburbs and not in the outer areas that are driven by investors that will be scared off, I think you'll do very well. If you look at the population prediction for Sydney, for Melbourne, it's actually tipped to outperform Sydney in the next decade. So, again, it's an international city. It's not like mining's left town or something strange has happened there. Yes, it has in terms of COVID, but I think it's just only a matter of time before it bounces back. I mean, everywhere else in Australia has probably done 60 or 70% over COVID. Melbourne's done about 10%. So from my mind, there's a reversion to the mean expected at some stage. And I think it'll be homeowners that drive that, not the other minor issues. And the investors will come in at the end when the market starts moving with emotion.
Yeah. We like to show up and go, oh, there's a thing happening here, is there? Like halfway through the boom.
Exactly.
And
it's like when I invite you to my party, Mike, you don't show up to the good part at the end. It's
fashionably late, mate.
Yeah.
So on the topic of the difference between property investing, buying an investment property, buying in a hot spot and creating long-term wealth, is there anything else you think we need to know?
No, I just think it's the way it's done. I mean, they're both a form of each other, right? But I guess I've labelled it because I think most investors don't begin with the end in mind. And I think it was Stephen Covey that said, begin with the end in mind. And I think by doing that and having an understanding of where you need to be and what you need to do, it's not a precise measurement. We talked before about having expectations. I think it's so much easier to invest for the next decade and what's going to happen in 10 or 12 years' time than it will be for the next 2 or 3 years because there's so many uncertainties there. But if we expect there to be a boom at some stage, some kind of bust, an X factor like there has been every decade for the last 30 or 40 years, we can pick the eye out of those really great locations that have been bulletproof, that have performed above average and given people greater returns, and just lock your money in there. It's going to be safer, and I wouldn't mind betting that in 10 or 12 years' time, you're going to come out on top as well.
Beautiful. Brett, thanks for sharing all of that gold with us today.
Always a pleasure. Hope to see you again.
Yeah, see you soon.